So, as you mentioned, this resolution by the UN Security Council was passed in April of 2015. So that is only 1 month after the Saudi-led intervention began in Yemen. Um, is it your view that when the UN Security Council made that resolution, that they had no idea that the intervention would last as long as it has and have such devastating effects as it has had, now creating the world's worst humanitarian crisis?
Definitely. As I was saying, my understanding of the intention at the time was really to try to signal displeasure with the Houthis, to signal that the UN saw them as behaving illegitimately, and they were trying to quickly get Yemen back on track towards that political transition. Unfortunately, as has often happened in American foreign policy, I think there was a tendency to underestimate the power of nationalism, and also just a long-standing Yemeni frustration with Saudi meddling in Yemen. So for decades, Saudi Arabia has pursued policies to keep Yemen fairly weak and divided. Some of that involved patronage, some of that involved just efforts to sort of play different groups off against each other. And I mean, and Yemenis were quite frustrated with this. And so while you have many people within Yemen, including the majority, pretty much all of my own friends in Yemen, reject control by the Houthis. They're not interested in having Houthi rule. They would like to get back to that political transition process that got started after Saleh was finally ousted in 2012. But at the same time, they're more opposed to what the Saudis are doing. The Saudis have caused significantly greater devastation. They have completely decimated Yemen's already very fragile infrastructure. Yemen already suffers from acute water shortages and inadequate food supply. Historically, Yemen had enjoyed a climate that did allow for agriculture, much more so than the rest of the Arabian Peninsula, for example, which is part of why Yemen's population is bigger. It was historically known, and even in Roman times, as Arabia Felix, or Happy Arabia, because it did have monsoon rains and it had access to water, and there are parts of Yemen that remain quite green. But in general, food produced in Yemen is very expensive. And so what we saw in, for example, the 1980s, the vast majority of Yemenis leaving to go work in Saudi Arabia, for example, or elsewhere, other parts of the Gulf that were going through the big boom years in the 70s and the 80s. And as a result, much less attention was devoted to Yemeni agriculture, and instead Yemen began to very significantly rely on food imports, which is part of why the blockade is so extremely devastating. So at the moment, it's not only a blockade on food, which is so devastating. Some food imports are getting in, although they are quite limited in what's even allowed to come in. So that's already just a constraint on Yemen's right to import what it needs and what it wants for its own population. But especially fuel has been the issue in 2021, that we've seen such few fuel ships allowed to enter the Hodeidah port, one of Yemen's main ports, one of Yemen's only ports, or only major international ports that can take large shipments of imports. And as a result, even if there is food or food aid that groups are trying to distribute, there's no fuel to distribute it around the country. You see these huge lines of people. We know that public sector employees in Yemen have not been paid for years, and so you have doctors with no fuel to run the generators and the generators are required because electricity has been cut, or the lines are down. So there's no fuel, doctors are not being paid. Essentially, the entire healthcare system is completely shutting down in the midst of COVID. Already, Yemen had been hard hit by a cholera outbreak, a devastating, sort of unprecedented level of a cholera outbreak in terms of what we've observed in the contemporary era. So just to get back to the point that what the Saudis have done is to truly devastate Yemen, whereas the Houthis are not to sugarcoat what they've done. I mean, they adopt policies that tend to be quite misogynistic. You know, in general, they're have committed really horrific human rights abuses, as tends to happen in under conditions of war. But in general, many Yemenis they're going to fight. Some of them are going to fight alongside the Houthis against the Saudis because nationalism, because the Houthis are Yemeni, and although that's not the case for everyone, but there are Yemenis who are fighting alongside the Houthis in order to try to get the Saudis out. And then once that happens, if foreign intervention were to finally stop, then you could have the internal dynamics return to a situation where Yemenis would need to sort of figure out among themselves what is the political system that is going to work for us moving forwards. One more quick note, just in general from scholarly literature on civil wars, we know in general that when there's foreign involvement, civil wars do tend to run much longer. Whereas if a civil war is really just limited to the internal actors, eventually they run out of resources and they have to figure out a way to live together and to resolve their differences politically.